Session. My name is Brian Hendricks. I'm the Quality Improvement Data Analyst at USET. Welcome to today's COVID Echo. Emily, if you'll start off with some introductions or some housekeeping tips.
Good morning. I'm Emily Field. I'm a Senior Evaluation Specialist here at USET. I just shared a link in the chat, which will bring you to a little questionnaire that you can claim continuing education medical credits on. It will also give you an opportunity to give us feedback on how we can improve these sessions. And if you could also share your name and tribal or organizational affiliation, including all USET staff in the chat. We don't have enough time for us all to go around and share our names, but it'd just be nice to have that down for everybody. And like Brian said, we are recording, and that is all I have to share. Thank you.
Thank you, Emily. We'll go ahead and get started today with Imani Ransby to give updates on COVID in the area. Oh, let me give you access. Sorry.
No, you're fine. Thanks, Brian.
There you go.
Greetings, everyone, and happy Friday. I hope you're having a wonderful day so far. Today, I'll be giving an update on the COVID-19 epidemiology for the USET region, our Nashville service area, and go over some of the information that's currently included in our weekly USET aggregate surveillance reports. At this time, we send these out weekly on Wednesdays to representatives of USET member tribal nations, as well as our USET staff. And these reports specifically include data on COVID-19 testing and vaccinations. I would like to mention that if you have had a chance to view this week's report, you will notice that the tribal nation specific information that's usually included in the vaccination portion of the report was not updated from last week's. We were previously receiving this information from the Nashville area office through weekly reports from sites, but because we've transitioned to using the IHS vaccine dashboard now to collect and display this information, we do not have access at this time. So permission and approval will be needed from the tribal nation for us to reobtain this data and provide you with the information that we have been getting this far. And I believe we will be discussing how to go about this approval process and hope to have some updates hopefully later this afternoon or early next week. So you will know what that looks like. So on the current slide, you will see the number of new positive test results, the cumulative total of positive results, and a 7-day positivity rate for the past week of March 30th to April 6th. For this week, the number of positive COVID-19 tests was 26, while the cumulative total of positive COVID-19 tests was 5,989, and the 7-day positivity rate at 3.5%. In general, we have seen a decline in these numbers, although there has been a slight uptake in the last couple of weeks, which you'll be able to see more clearly on the next slide. But I would like to highlight that the percent positivity for this week was lower than what was reported last week. We were at 5.6% during the week of March 23rd to the 30th and saw a 2% drop in the rate. That brings us to 3.5% for this week. So the slide featured here shows you the number of new positive COVID-19 test results from week to week over a 12-week period. As mentioned on the last slide, for the current week of March 30th to April 6th, the number of new positives in our USET region was 26. And this was a clear decrease from the previous week where we saw an uptake in the amount of cases. Overall, though, I definitely say that transmission has slowed down significantly since the latter half of 2020 and the beginning of this year. Although this seems to be the case, we strongly recommend and advocate for the continuation of prevention measures used to control the spread of COVID-19, which we're all familiar with by now: washing your hands, social distancing, avoiding large gatherings, and getting vaccinated. So the following graph shows you the rate of new COVID-19 cases per 10,000 by USET counties, USET states, and the United States. We've given a 12-week time frame for this information as well, so that you can kind of better follow the outbreak across time. Please note that this data was specifically obtained from CDC and state health departments, and it's not limited specifically to tribal citizens. We still feel that this information is beneficial as it has served as a good indicator to what is going on in and around the USET region, specifically in regards to the number or amount of COVID-19 cases that are being seen locally, as well as at a state and national level. And so for the current week of March 30th to April 6th, the PERCTA purchase and referred care delivery area, or USET county rate, was reported as 18.67 cases per 10,000, while the USET states rate was at 13.81 cases per 10,000, and lastly, the United States rate at 13.68 cases per 10,000. In addition, for this past week, the USET county rate was highest, followed by the USET state rate, and lastly, the United States rate. As mentioned before, we can see a clear and continuous decrease across the board, with the USET county rate still demonstrating the largest presence of COVID-19 infections at the county level compared to the USET states and the United States. There was a noted decline in the USET county and states rate from the last week, while the United States rate slightly increased. And again, you can kind of see that we did have an uptake in cases across the board during the week of March 23rd to the 30th, and even a little bit in the week prior to that. So the next few slides will include an overview of the vaccination data featured in our weekly surveillance reports. It is our hope that you find this information useful in tracking the progress made with vaccine administration at your tribal nation and in your geographic area. Additionally, we also hope that the information can be used to assist with making decisions related to your COVID-19 vaccination program. So the slide displays shows you the percentage of population fully vaccinated, and it's broken down by reporting facilities in the Nashville area, the United States, and then the Indian Health Service. Please note that these graphs are displaying numbers from the previous week of March 30th, as well as for the current report week of April 6th for all data points aside from the yellow bar, which is reflecting information solely from last week, March 30th. As I stated, we do not have this week's information available for that. I briefly touched on that at the beginning of the presentation. And again, we are working with the area office to coordinate a way to best obtain permission and approval for tribal nations so that the information can be retained. The United States and IHS percentages were obtained from data retrieved from CDC's COVID-19 data tracker site, so that information is up to date. So for this past week, the percentage of population fully vaccinated for the United States was at 19%, while the Indian Health Service was at 18.8%. And again, for last week's reporting facilities in the IHS Nashville area, that percent was at 31. And so as reported on our last echo, you can see that as a region, we are still performing quite well, even when only referencing last week's percentage. So wonderful job to everyone, and thank you for all of your continued hard work on that. This graph is similar to the last, but instead it displays the percentage of population fully vaccinated, broken down by all USET states, and again, reporting facilities in the Nashville area. Information from the previous week is also given for this visual so that you can see the percent increase that has occurred from week to week. Percentages for individual USET states appear to range from 12 to 23% for the current week, with 1 to 3% increases seen from the previous week. And again, I really think this graph showcases the progress we have and are making as a region or area. This last slide gives you the percentage of delivered COVID-19 vaccination doses that have been administered. The information for this graph is broken down by reporting facilities in the Nashville area, the United States, USET states combined, and lastly, individual USET states. So the percentage reported for reporting facilities in the Nashville area for the last week of March 31st was 64.7. This percentage, along with the other data points, demonstrate a good job being done in getting the vaccine that has been delivered to various sites administered to the public. I also want to note that I read that now every 1 in 4 people in the US have been vaccinated. So that is also really great news. So again, wonderful job, everyone. And I'd just like to close by reminding you to please feel free to reach out to our USET tech team if you have any questions or concerns, COVID or non-COVID related. We are always happy to assist you and provide general assistance. Our email address is usetepi@usetinc.org. And if you would like to get in contact with us, please feel free to do so. So thank you, and thank you for your time today. And I'll take any questions.
Thank you, Imani, for a great presentation. Do we have any questions for Imani or the USET tech team? Okay, hearing none, we can move on to Dr. Brown's presentation.
Depending on your time zone, good morning or good afternoon. And thanks for the opportunity to talk to you today. I've turned off my camera to improve my bandwidth. So you'll have to sort of listen to my disembodied voice. Today's presentation is really supposed to be a question and answer. So it's meant to be interactive. If you have questions about vaccines, just type them into the chat. I think Brian's going to be monitoring that. If you'll go ahead to the next slide, Taloa, thanks. So we are on day 399 of the COVID-19 pandemic. And as I said, we're gonna just cover questions and answers today. I do have a didactic presentation. I've made out 3 questions that I'm going to give you the answer to. But hopefully this may lead to other questions. And again, just type them into the chat or raise your hand as we go along. Next slide. So my objectives for today is for you to be familiar with how the currently authorized vaccines work, be familiar with their efficacy and safety and the similarities and differences between them. And also, I really hope that you will feel more comfortable answering questions that you may get about COVID-19 vaccines. There is a lot of vaccine hesitancy. I think it's up to all of us to try to allay people's fears and make people more comfortable about getting vaccinated, because that's really our best way to get out of the pandemic. The only other way is to let it burn through the population until everybody's been either infected or vaccinated. But I think vaccination is a much better way to do it. Next slide, please. I see there was a question about COVID and pregnancy. So I'll if you'll remind me, I'll address that after I've gone through these first 3 questions. So the first question is, how do the currently approved vaccines for COVID-19 work? And if we go to the next slide, in order to really understand how they work, you need to know a little bit about just immunology. So I'm going to talk for just a minute here, try to keep it at a high level about our body's adaptive immune response. That is, our response to a particular pathogen, whether that's a virus or a bacteria or something else. So there's a little picture here that's supposed to represent the SARS-CoV-2 virus. Those little spikes sticking up are how it attaches and enters our cells. Once it gets inside our cells, it starts to replicate. So it makes many, many, many copies of itself, and those copies get spit out of our cells and go to infect other cells and make more copies. Now, there are these cells that we have that are part of our immune system called antigen-presenting cells. There are various types of these, but basically these recognize foreign material, antigens. And so they run into one of these SARS-CoV-2 viruses and they say, hey, this is some foreign material. So they pick it up and they present it to a T cell called a helper T cell. This is a lymphocyte. There are basically two kinds of lymphocytes, T cells and B cells. There are actually many, many subtypes, but those are the two basic types of T cells. So the helper T cell picks up and recognizes this foreign material. Next slide, please. And then that helper T cell goes out and recruits other lymphocytes. The B cells, which then make specific antibodies against the virus, and then cytotoxic T cells, which are able to destroy infected cells. Now, antibodies can bind to the virus at various points and block it from entering our cells. The antibodies also mark viruses or mark infected cells so that the cytotoxic T cells or natural killer cells, various other cells can come along and take care of the virus and keep us from being overwhelmed and dying from the infection. Now, eventually we create memory cells, and these can be either memory B cells, which can produce more antibodies, or memory T cells, which can later on recognize if we come into contact with the virus again, it can recognize it and destroy them. Next slide, please. So that's just kind of a high level overview of the immune system. Now, I just want to very briefly review something about cells. So, all higher organisms from bacteria to mammals are made up of cells. And the thing I really want to point out to you here is the cell nucleus that I've marked and I've highlighted in yellow. The cell nucleus is where our DNA, our genetic material, is contained. And then the other thing I want you to see are ribosomes. Ribosomes are little things inside of cells that make protein. And I'm going to next talk about, again, at a high level overview, how they do this. So next slide. So let's briefly review genetics. So in our cells, as I said, we have DNA inside the nucleus. Whenever our cells need to make a protein, that DNA is transcribed into messenger RNA. And then the messenger RNA goes out into the cell cytoplasm outside the nucleus to the ribosomes. The ribosomes can read that messenger RNA and translate it in order to string together amino acids to make proteins. Now, proteins can be many different things, can be structural proteins like our muscles and other tissue, or it could be a hormone or an enzyme. There are lots of different proteins that ribosomes can make, and the instructions for making the proteins are carried from the DNA through messenger RNA to the ribosomes. Now, after the ribosomes finish making a protein, that messenger RNA gets degraded and it it doesn't go back into the nucleus. And that's kind of important in understanding how the mRNA vaccines work and how they're safe. So next slide, please. So that's the science. I wanted to give you a background in order to answer the question, well, how do these vaccines work? So there are about 8 different technologies used today to make vaccines. I'm really just going to talk about non-replicating viral vectored vaccines and messenger RNA vaccines. Both of these are genetic vaccines. The non-replicating viral vector vaccines are actually DNA vaccines, but they use a virus in order to transport that DNA inside our cells. Next slide, please. So just again, to briefly review the coronavirus structure, it has these spike proteins stuck all over its surface, and that is the target for these vaccines, because again, remember, it's the spike protein that attaches to our cells and allows the virus to get inside our cells and do its damage. Next slide. So let's talk first about the RNA vaccines, or the messenger RNA vaccines. So the way these work, in the lab, they make a string of RNA that codes for the spike protein of the SARS-CoV-2 virus. Now, this messenger RNA, remember I said messenger RNA is pretty fragile and it's easily degraded. So in order to get it inside our cells, it has to be packaged somehow. And the way that they worked this out was to put it inside little tiny particles of lipids, or, sort of these oily like particles. Now, RNA vaccines were first sort of contemplated back around 1990. And, somebody came up with the idea that, hey, we could make messenger RNA and get our body cells to make the antigens that then our immune system would pick up and make us immune to whatever it is we're trying to make ourselves immune to. The problem is getting the RNA inside our cells. So it took years to figure out how to package this messenger RNA. And that was only recently perfected about maybe 3 years ago, 2017 or 18 or so. And fortunately for us, it was just in time for this pandemic. So what happens with messenger RNA vaccines, these strands of messenger RNA that code for the spike protein, they go inside the cell, and once inside the cell, this RNA has the ability to replicate. It's then taken up by the ribosomes and translated to make the spike protein, which is the antigen that we're interested in. These spike proteins are then secreted outside the cells. An antigen presenting cell comes along and recognizes it's foreign material. It's something that the immune system needs to take care of. So then the regular immune system thing happens. The helper T cell comes along, recruits B cells and other T cells, and voila, we make ourselves immune. Next slide. This next slide is just to remind you, these messenger RNA vaccines are considered in the broad category of genetic vaccines, but they skip the DNA step. They, by injecting messenger RNA, we take the DNA out of the equation. And that's kind of important because, next slide, please. That's kind of important in understanding how safe these vaccines are, because messenger RNA, it's a one-way street. It does not go back inside the nucleus, so it can't do anything to our DNA. And it's rapidly degraded after the ribosomes use it. So it's really, that's what makes these vaccines so inherently safe. And, there's a lot of misinformation out there about how these vaccines will change your DNA. The truth is they can't. The body cells just don't work that way. So next slide. I think next we're going to talk, yes, about non-replicating viral vector vaccines. Now, the way these work, an adenovirus, which is a virus that causes a common cold, these are DNA viruses. So they remove some of the DNA from the adenovirus and they substitute some DNA that codes for the SARS-CoV-2 spike protein. So they take out the part that allows the adenovirus to replicate, and that's why they're called non-replicating viral vectors. So this is then injected into our body. It's the adenovirus is what transports it inside our cells. It then releases the DNA, the gene that codes for the SARS-CoV-2 antigen. That is then translated to messenger RNA, or transcribed to messenger RNA. And then it produces the spike protein, very much the way that the messenger RNA vaccines work. So then it goes through the same immunological process and we become immune and make memory cells so that if we ever come into contact with the SARS-CoV-2 virus, we mount an immune response and we don't get sick. Next slide. This is just to remind you that these viral vectored vaccines are DNA vaccines, so they actually go through the DNA to messenger RNA to protein sequence. Next slide. And you can go ahead and skip to the next slide. The one thing I did want to say, there is a theoretical downside to viral vector vaccines, and that is if a person has strong immunity to the adenovirus, your body may defeat the adenovirus before it can get inside our cells and deliver the genetic message. So that may account for the difference in efficacy in the viral vectored vaccines, which I'll talk about now. So let me just pause here and say, does anybody have any questions about how these vaccines work? And I'm sorry, I haven't really been monitoring the chat, so. Okay, I'm not hearing any questions, but if you have, if one occurs to you, please ask. So the next question, what are the differences in the 3 authorized COVID-19 vaccines in the United States? Next slide. So I'm just going to go through this kind of by way of a table. So there are 3 vaccines. 2 are messenger RNA vaccines, and 1 is a non-replicating viral vectored vaccine. So the Pfizer-BioNTech vaccine and Moderna's vaccine are messenger RNA vaccines. The Janssen Johnson & Johnson is a viral vectored vaccine. So what about efficacy? Well, Pfizer and Moderna both are 94, 95% effective in the phase 3 trials at preventing all symptomatic disease. The Janssen was not quite as good. It was only about 66% overall effective at preventing any symptomatic disease. But when it comes to severe disease and death, all 3 are very effective at preventing death. In the phase 3 trial, Moderna had no severe cases. I think Pfizer only had 1. Janssen had 1 or 2. So, you know, they're very effective at keeping people out of the hospital and out of the morgue. Now, what about efficacy in older people? It's a little bit hard to compare that because all 3 measured it differently, but basically their efficacy in older people is about the same as it is in younger people. In terms of side effects, the messenger RNA vaccines seem to give people a little bit higher rate of side effects, but really all 3 side effects are pretty tolerable. There have been very, very few serious side effects. As far as what age they're approved in, Pfizer was actually able to get theirs approved for 16 and older. Moderna and Janssen are currently for 18 and older, but all three of these vaccines are currently being tested in younger kids. Pfizer already has data for the 12 to 15-year-old age group, and I expect that sometime in the next couple of months, that'll be approved for 12 and above. I expect Moderna and Janssen will follow closely behind. Now, I do want to make a quick point here. One of my colleagues recently pointed out that probably all three of these vaccines will be approved for teenagers, the 12 and above age group, within the next 3 to 4 months. And because of that, we need to make sure that that age group is caught up on their other vaccines, because at least right now, you're not supposed to give any of these vaccines within 2 weeks of giving any other vaccine. So that's just an aside I wanted to point out. Next slide. So as far as dose, the Pfizer, it's 0.3 milliliters. Moderna and Janssen are both a half milliliter. Pfizer and Janssen both come in 5-dose vials, although Pfizer, you can almost always get a 6th dose. Moderna has 10-dose vials, and they've just received approval to increase that to 15-dose vials. And then the Pfizer vaccine, you have to dilute it with some sterile saline. The other two you don't. Pfizer is 2 doses 21 days apart. Moderna is 2 doses 28 days apart. And the Janssen, at least for now, is a single dose. There is an ongoing trial to see if the efficacy improves with 2 doses spaced 8 weeks apart, but we don't have that data out yet. So I'm going to stop here and answer Emily's question. What about 9-year-olds? So I know that Pfizer and Moderna are both conducting trials right now in children who are 6 to 11. It's probably going to take 3 or 4 months to do those trials, and then another month or two to get approval. So I think we'll probably see a vaccine for the 6 and older age group, maybe within 6 months or so. But that's just a guess on my part. Next slide. So they do have a little bit different temperature requirements. Up until now, the Pfizer vaccine has required ultra cold storage, minus 70 degrees centigrade. Moderna can be stored at regular deep freeze temperatures, minus 20 degrees centigrade. And then the Janssen can be stored in the refrigerator for at least 3 months. Pfizer is coming out now and saying that their vaccine can probably be stored at higher temperatures, just similarly to the Moderna. I'm not sure if that approval has been given yet by the FDA, but I expect it will be soon. So you won't have to keep it, at those ultra cold temperatures, which will be really, really helpful. Pfizer is good in the refrigerator for up to 5 days. Moderna's got an approval up to 30, and Janssen can be up to 3 months. Now, once they're at room temperature, though, they're not stable for very long, and all three have to be used pretty quickly. Next slide. So, are these vaccines safe? I mean, that's probably what drives a lot of the vaccine hesitancy, is people just, can we really know they're safe? These were produced so fast. And I'm sure if you've heard me talk before about vaccines, what I'm about to say is just a review. Next slide. So these vaccines were made in absolute record time, fortunately. And I can remember a year ago hearing that we might have a vaccine in 12 to 18 months, which would mean, we'd only just now be getting the vaccines. Fortunately, they were able to speed that up because of a number of things. For one thing, people were highly motivated to get this done. We had a pandemic that initially, we were seeing case fatality rates above 10% initially. So it was very scary and still is. I mean, we've had worldwide over 2 million deaths. The internet today allows for much faster communication and sharing of knowledge. The Chinese had sequenced the genetic material of the SARS-CoV-2 virus in early January. They immediately made that available to other scientists worldwide, and they went to work very quickly on these vaccines. The advances in genetics over the last couple of decades, that's just been phenomenal. And that has allowed these 3 vaccines, which are all 3 are genetic vaccines, either RNA or DNA. And just the advances that we've had in genetic technology has allowed for that. Now, there was previous work done on vaccines for both SARS and MERS, and that really gave us a head start. They knew that the best place to target was probably the spike protein because of that previous work. So they were able to quickly come up with a good antigenic target. As I alluded to before, the messenger RNA vaccine technology was just recently perfected 2 or 3 years ago. Also, the Janssen vaccine uses something called the AD26, which stands for adenovirus serotype 26. They already had produced an Ebola vaccine, a successful Ebola vaccine with that platform. So all they had to do was modify it to code for the SARS-CoV-2 spike protein. Then there was unprecedented financial support from governments and private foundations that removed financial liability from developers and producers of the vaccine. There were a lot of parallel processes going on. Because of that financial support, they went ahead and started manufacturing vaccine before the trials were completed. Normally, you'd never do that because of the financial liability. The other thing is when you have a pandemic going on and you've got millions of cases of the disease, you can do a phase 3 trial in just a few months rather than taking years to accumulate enough cases. So the phase 3 trials really only took about 3 months to do, and they were able to get efficacy and safety data in that time. And then one more thing I want to point out about safety. If vaccines are going to have a bad side effect, some kind of dangerous rather than just an irritating side effect, those side effects are usually going to show up within 6 weeks. I mean, that's been the experience for decades with other vaccine development. So the FDA said that these companies had to have at least 2 months of safety data, 2 months from the second dose of vaccine in the case of the mRNA vaccines, in order to say, okay, we've got enough data, enough time, and here we know that there aren't any bad side effects cropping up. So next slide. I think this is my last real slide. Yes. And now for your questions. I'm going to go ahead and take Dr. Mira's question, and that was about, any update about pregnancy. There's some good news on this front. So in the trials, there were some people who got pregnant despite being told not to. And there were about an equal number in the vaccine group and the placebo group that got pregnant. So that kind of answers the question about, do these vaccines cause sterility? And the answer is no, they don't. There's no reason to think that they would. But there's a crazy rumor out there that the spike protein is similar to an enzyme or a hormone or something in the placenta, and that's just not really true. That rumor was apparently started by a guy who had been fired by Pfizer years ago. But anyway, they now have some safety data. They've so far had quite a few women. There was a recent study that was published, I think, in the New England Journal. They had quite a few women who had gotten pregnant after vaccination or had gotten the vaccine during pregnancy at various points. So far, there's been no increase in either spontaneous abortion or any kind of birth defects. What they have found is that the babies also have antibodies to SARS-CoV-2. So it's probably actually a good thing to go ahead and get vaccinated if you're pregnant, because it will protect your newborn. So it's also been safe for breastfeeding, and they actually find antibodies in the breast milk. Now, whether or not those are really protective is probably a good question, and we don't really know for sure. But it's nice to think that, the newborns are getting these antibodies through the breast milk that might have some protection for them too. So we have another question about what proportion of allergic reactions are to the polyethylene glycol additive, and is this in all three vaccines? So that's a great question. I'll tell you what I know about it. So early on, as soon as the messenger RNA vaccines, or the Pfizer one anyway, started being used in Great Britain, there were suddenly reports of anaphylactic reactions. And this was quite alarming. And it was thought to be due to one of the components of the lipid nanoparticles, which is polyethylene glycol. This is a long organic molecule that some people are allergic to. We're exposed to it all the time, as it's in a lot of food additives and stabilizers. The Janssen vaccine does not really have polyethylene glycol, but it does have something called polysorbate as not really a preservative, it's more of a buffer or stabilizer for the vaccine. And polysorbate has some similarities to polyethylene glycol. And so some people are allergic to polysorbate. So it's possible to have an allergic reaction to the Janssen vaccine as well. Hopefully that answers your question. Fortunately, these allergic reactions seem to be pretty rare. So any updates on how long the vaccines are effective for? The answer is yes. We now know that people who have received the mRNA vaccines are good for at least 6 months. At least Pfizer came out just a few days ago with that data, that people who have been vaccinated at 6 months, they still have high levels, protective levels of antibodies. So that's good news. We'll keep following that and see how long it lasts. Do we know what percentage of cases over the past few months are in fully vaccinated people, that is, breakthrough infections? That's a great question, Dr. Bunio. And the answer is yes, there is some data on that. There's some really good data that's coming out of Israel, at least on the Pfizer vaccine. The good news is that in Israel, where they've now vaccinated a large percentage of their 9 million people, mostly with the Pfizer vaccine, Israel has, a really good healthcare system that has a highly integrated electronic medical record, and they've been able to mine this for data. And what they have shown is that the vaccines in actual real world use, at least in Israel, are at least as good as the phase 3 trials. They've been showing somewhere between 90 to 95% efficacy. So there have been some cases in vaccinated people, but those have been extremely few. And it looks like it's playing out, at least in Israel, that they're highly efficacious. In addition to that, the CDC just recently came out with an analysis showing that both of the messenger RNA vaccines are at least 90% efficacious in the US. In other words, they perform about as well in widespread use in the United States as they did in the trials. So, it looks like the efficacy that came out of the phase 3 highly controlled trial situation translates pretty well into real life and regular use. Does that answer your question?
Yeah.
Okay, thanks. What other questions?
So Harry, can I ask you a question?
Absolutely.
So we have a lot of questions on people who have had a reaction to, so far I've seen reaction to all 3 vaccines, Moderna, Pfizer, and Johnson vaccine. These reactions were labeled anaphylaxis. I'm not 100% sure they actually were anaphylaxis, to be honest, but let's assume for a second that they were.
Mm-hmm.
So the question is, if you have that severe reaction on any of the 3 vaccines, what is your recommendation for the second dose if they got an RNA? And if they got the Johnson, that's it. They don't need another dose, so they're out of the woods. But let's say in the future we need a booster or another type of vaccine. What would be your recommendation to those patients?
That's a great question. My recommendation at this point would be that they don't get another dose of vaccine. I think we do know that the Janssen gives pretty decent protection, gives excellent protection against severe disease with 1 dose. So they really don't need another, at least for now. With the mRNA vaccines, 1 dose gives you somewhere between 60, 70, 80, maybe as high as 90% protection. Different studies have shown different numbers with that. But my recommendation would be, don't get a second mRNA vaccine of either type, because I think the likelihood of another, if it's truly an allergic reaction, they're probably going to have at least as bad, possibly worse reaction the next time. Yeah. So that brings up a great point too, I think, and that is why it's so critically important that we get as many people vaccinated as possible. Once we reach the stage of community immunity, the people that can't get that second dose should be protected. Now, if there's a variant that comes along that's the vaccines don't touch, I think we're in trouble. Because again, I don't think it would be very safe to try to give those people a second dose.
Thank you.
Sure. Thanks for the question. It's a great question. Here's a non-vaccine question, I guess, and that is, it looks like COVID testing has decreased, and is that concerning? I find it kind of encouraging in a way. Apparently there are less people getting sick now, and so there's less testing being done. At least that's how I would interpret that. Some of my colleagues might have a different take on that or a different slant. Does anybody else have a feeling about that?
Hi, this is Christy. I have thought about that too. I know we had less testing this week across the Nashville area office. I wonder too if it's the season and spring break is still occurring, so I think that's part of it too. People are moving around and they're out and about, so there's less testing, but I think it remains to be seen as to the reason why. I think I would like to see, we continue with community-based screening as opposed to symptom or exposure based screening, but I guess it just remains to be seen.
Right. I can tell you, and Dr. Bunio probably has much better information on this than I do, but anecdotally from what I'm seeing at Cherokee, we're seeing fewer cases now than we were 2 or 3 months ago.
Yeah, that's true. And I mean, I was also thinking about, now that the CDC says if you're fully vaccinated and you have an exposure, you don't need a test. So
Right.
we're doing less contact tracing testing.
Right.
I find that that's interesting because we've been doing the Bluestone saliva tests, those of us who've been in the building every week. And most of us now are certainly fully vaccinated, but what we're getting from the health department and from Connie Hilbert is we're still going to test weekly, just to ensure as more people start to return to the building. My staff is at full capacity. We still have an empty spot if anybody wants a job, but so a lot of people have said, well, I'm fully vaccinated, the numbers are going down, why do we still have to test? And now that we've got more people coming back into the building, they have to start testing weekly using the Bluestone, and they're like, well, how does this all work? It's like, oh, it's no big deal, we've been doing it since October. So it does kind of bring up some interesting points with regards to being fully vaccinated, now feeling like you've got some more freedom with regards to travel and things like that, but yet the testing you're seeing going down, but yet we're still testing here weekly.
And Carrie, I don't think that's a bad strategy.
Yeah, and the thing that's coming up for us is we're vaccinated. So, and since the CDC says one fully vaccinated household can visit another household, people are extrapolating that to say, well, now we can all eat together again and have big meetings. And I keep saying, no, we're not there yet. That's a whole different ball game when you put 50 people in a room as opposed to 2 people having a sandwich. But it's a logical conclusion, I think, that people come to. If I can safely meet with one unvaccinated person, why can't I meet with 50
or 100?
Yeah. So,
or go to a stadium full of people. Yeah.
Yeah, it gets out of control.
Yeah.
Do we have any other questions for Dr. Brown or Dr. Mera, Dr. Bunio? Just a reminder to give feedback in the chat. There's a link to the survey. If you will fill that out, you can claim continuing education credits there.
Also, just as a upcoming future attractions, Dr. Mira will be presenting in 2 weeks on COVID and HIV positive people. So that should be a really interesting learning opportunity for all of us.
Now you put me on the spot. I'm gonna have to study now.
Sorry.
Okay, well, if there's no other questions, we can go ahead and wrap up today. Thank you all for attending. Just a reminder to give the feedback in the survey and have a great weekend.
Bye.
Thank you.
Bye, everybody.
Bye.